So let's talk about fire. Here we have an image of some elk or mule deer in a stream. This is in the Yellowstone area. This is an image that lots of people who are proponents of fire like to point out when you start looking at how wildlife responds to fire, is that there's no argument that fire is definitely a natural disturbance within the ecological realm, and it's been around a lot longer than we have. However, as the Fire Wars video pointed out, is that by suppressing fire for so long, what we've done is we've built up a situation to where once fires do occur now, they're no longer the smaller fires that these areas used to get with frequent occurrence. The firestorm at Peshtigo, in the video they talked about the large fire of 1910. That was this large disaster. The video was actually in air. Because even though that fire of 1910 in the western United States burned more area, the Chicago fire, or the Peshtigo fire, more properly named, was a massive fire that occurred from all the way from northeastern Wisconsin all the way over into Michigan. It was a result of a large low pressure system slash cold front. They think that tornadoes were actually whipped up along the front that whipped up this firestorm. But what this did was this killed thousands of people. Some people say that this fire was a bigger natural disaster than the Galveston hurricane. There's a lot of debate in that because many of the people who died in this fire were never located because they were literally vaporized by the heat, and you had lots of people living in a landscape to where there was no numbers to establish where they were. Many people went missing in this fire. They don't know if they just left afterwards or if indeed they perished and there was no remains left. This was a huge fire. You look over here and you can see how big of an area this fire took place in, but it was a very grim event. If it wasn't the largest, I would actually argue that it was the largest natural disaster that ever occurred in the history of this country. It definitely killed more people than the fire of 1910 out west. Uh, it really changed the face of this landscape and the types of industry and practices going on. I'm familiar with this fire because I am from Menominee, Michigan, and have seen the Peshtigo Fire Museum way too many times. I'm not going to read these out loud, but I threw these little excerpts in from a great book called Firestorm at Peshtigo, and it just gives you an idea of the scope of this fire and some of the terrible things that occurred in this fire. Forest fire, I'm not going to go into this too much, but forest fire is not without controversy. It goes back and forth between a very hot topic in the media and the controversy surrounding it, depending on the fire season. But we definitely have a policy of fire suppression in this country. Why? The video alludes to it a little bit, but there's entire books written on why we developed this fire suppression. We look at it in terms of the modern fire suppression that we have. It's many ways it's a point of no return because of how much we've moved out into these wild environments, and there it's your urban wildlife interface. We also have a huge amount of fire suppression. Fire suppression. The controversy surrounding fire suppression is really about the whole buildup of fuels over time and the issue with logging. The logging issue comes about because there's a lot of debate out there in terms of where does environmentalism go wrong and where does logging go wrong. A lot of loggers argue that it's because of the environmental movement letting forests sit for so long and that have not been thinned out and selectively cut that you have these fires occurring, and had these companies been able to go out and thin these forests out, that would have occurred. However, on the environmental end of it, a lot of environmentalists will point out that a lot of the selective cut logging that's mentioned isn't really select cut logging, and it's clear cutting, and indeed the numbers do show that you have clear cutting operations going on, and when those clear cutting operations occur, the slash is left behind. And then the subsequent new growth forest is surrounded with slash, which is a huge amount of fuel on the ground. It really comes down to, we are faced with the situation today where we have a very high fuel load, and when forests burn, they burn with a much more intensity than they used to. And how we get to a sense of, I hate to use the word normalcy, is probably going to have to be a mix of selective burns and some thinning operations, as the video suggested. But getting to that point is a completely different situation. We also have a very low amount of diversity now in these old stands when you have these thinning operations occurring. We look at fire regimes before suppression. Now, some of the in the video that you watched, you had some fire regimes mentioned as well. But you start looking at these fire regimes, it depends on the community. If you start looking at communities in California, such as Chaparral, you're talking about a 1 to 5 year burn rate. But some of the more common burn rates is something like ponderosa pine with 2 to 10 years, pinyon juniper woodlands 10 to 30 years, spruce fir forest at 150 years. It depends on the forest type, but what this comes down to is that all forests are subject to some type of a fire. It's just the frequency varies on the climate and therefore the vegetation type. There's a lot of hyperbole surrounding fires as well. In 2007, there was in the eastern Upper Peninsula, there was a fire called the Sleeper Lake Fire. And the way it was covered really made people think that there was this massive firestorm. And I was following this fire, and from what I was reading, it sounded like it was just completely out of control. And I decided that I wanted to go and check out this fire and see what it looked like. So I took a class there for a field trip, and we went and looked at the remains, and what I saw was not what was related to what the media was reporting. This is what we saw. This is what you would call a ground fire. It's a very low intensity burn. And there was areas with this type of burning all over the place. As you can see, it didn't really, all it did was burn the material on the ground. It didn't even get up into the canopies of these trees. Here goes another shot overlooking a bog. You can see here once again, ground, some trunk burning, but nowhere near Firestorm and the raging inferno that was being reported by the media as if it was this out of control fire. Here goes some more shots of that fire. Definitely a ground fire. So how do fires start? The number way that fires start is from lightning. You can also get sparks from falling rocks in mountainous regions. You can get volcanic activity, but more and more so humans. Whether or not it's arson, deliberately set by a controlled burn, or negligence. When you look at fire, much like what you saw in the video, there's different factors that control it. You want to look at the fuel load a lot, because the fuel load is what is surrounding a lot of the controversy right now with what we have going on in our forest through the 100% suppression program. But you also want to look at the terrain. Fire does tend to burn uphill, however, it doesn't always behave that way if you have the right wind conditions. And this, as they stressed in the video, is your X factor. This is the one that you cannot predict. This is the one that you can have a fire that's a raging intensity, and 2 days later you could have a rainstorm move in and it's nowhere near of what it once was. Also, with meteorological conditions, these are often what will go from just having a small fire into a massive fire outbreak, is if you get the right winds whipping up. Here goes your characteristics of fire with your different classes. I just showed you some images of those ground fires where you just had a very low amount of burning, just burning some stuff that was on the ground. You have surface fires. This is where you start getting some trunks burning, you get some bushes burning, and then of course you have the crown fires, which is what they were covering a lot in the video you watched, and where in that image I showed you with the deer in the river, where the crowns of the trees are burning. These are very high intensity fires. When you start getting to crown fires, you start getting into fires that will alter the characteristics of the soils. With the fire intensity, the higher the intensity, the higher the heat yield, the more availability you have of fire to spread, and you have a much higher rate of spread with the more intensive fire. A very intense fire is actually going to generate its own weather because it's going to be sucking in so much air to fuel it. Fires are not uncommon. Despite how you see them reported in the media as a very strange event, fire is very much a natural disturbance that has been occurring since well before we were along. You take a look at this map, and this is just from 1959 to 1999. You can see that the boreal forest and the parklands between prairie and boreal forest have been subjected to quite a few fires. Now in Canada, these fires are often just let to burn because it's such a remote landscape. If you were to go, I'm not going to go to Google Earth, but if you were to look on Google Earth, you can actually look at during the summer months where fires are occurring. We have satellites that are meant to, they have thermal detection sensors on them, and they can pick up where fires are occurring. You don't really need fire towers and fire planes anymore because these fires can be picked up by satellites now. And you can see all the little dots. This is up in northern Ontario. All these little dots are where you have fires occurring, and this is in the boreal forest. So if you were to be in if you were in North America in the year 1800 and you looked at a map and you had the ability to look at the Earth from space, you would see this going on all over across North America. When it comes to fighting fires, there's a high cost. Now this is these are some images I took from a plane following the fires in Southern California. And what you can see here is you can see how all these slopes around these hilltops are completely burned, devoid of houses. All over in here you see that. You see some areas that have been saved by fire. Fire is also very controversial because it's very expensive to fight a fire. And the costs go up year after year. This link is a story. I'd like you to listen to that story. It talks about the cost of fighting fires and how really what it boils down to many times is that a lot of the things that we use to fight fires are not really effective, but populations like to see it because it makes them feel that the fire is being fought against. The other issue with fighting fires is that there's a lot of corruption that goes on in terms of billing the government. In the case of this radio story, you'll see how there was a tent that was being rented, and the cost of that tent getting rented out every day was in the thousands of dollars. And it was not really that special of a tent. And finally, I want to just connect this all to the wildland urban interface. This shows where you had a fire moving through, you had all these houses burned down. Notice how these houses are right up against this forest environment. With the advent of four-wheel drive, with the advent of so many portable devices, with the advent of roads going into many different areas in our country, we have been able to build right up next to the forest. And people like this because you have a sense of being in the wilderness, you have a sense of getting away from it all, but also being right up against the forest. And this is very nice right up until you have an event such as a fire. Because oftentimes these communities have no restrictions on how close they can build to the edge of this forest, nor what types of building materials they have. And when a fire does occur, these houses go up quite rapidly. It does not have to be like this because if you start looking at houses that did survive in the California fires, the individuals that did put on the slate tile roofs, the ones that had a decent sized perimeter from their home, the ones who kept flammable materials out of their yards, they're the ones who had houses that were sometimes surrounded by houses that burned, that had a house that didn't burn. There's things you can do. There's more and more people are being forced to take up these restrictions, but it's something that within your lifetime you're going to see more and more of this come up as an issue because of that wildland urban interface. Whether or not this is related to whether people can go hunt for deer within town, when you start looking at how you have mountain lion attacks by people who are living in these developments, where you have coyotes in these environments, or when you have fires. This is all a result of people moving from that urban environment into the wildland, and in this case where they're interfacing. And here we have a map that shows that, where you see the yellow. This is where you have that heavy wildland urban interface, or where you have that mixture of urban in the wild. This is where you're going to get, there's a huge risk for forest fire damage in these areas, and this is where you see those issues coming up with wildlife and the controversy on how that should be harvested. So that's it for forestry. What you want to do is make sure that you read those readings, go through the other lecture, listen to the radio stories, and understand the content of this so you can take the quiz associated with this lecture.